In the pre-dawn darkness of April 18, 1942, at 3:20 in the morning, the USS Hornet pitched through the North Pacific swells while her lookout's voice crackled urgently through the bridge telephone. Surface contact, bearing 020 degrees, range 12,000 yards. Lieutenant Commander Frank Ackers lowered his binoculars and reached for the ship's radio. What nobody aboard that carrier understood at that moment was that a simple fishing boat, the Japanese picket vessel Nito Maru, had just altered the course of history. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, lashed down to the wooden flight deck with rope and cable, were about to become America's answer to Pearl Harbor. The plan itself seemed insane to military planners, an operation so desperate, so audacious, that even its architects whispered it was nothing more than a suicide mission. The Pacific dawn revealed something terrifying. Mountainous waves crashed over the Hornet's bow with stunning force. Wind gusts howled across the deck, pushing 40 knots and more. Rain drove horizontally, cutting visibility down to less than 5 miles. These brutal conditions were far worse than anything Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had practiced for back at Eglin Field in Florida. They were also 250 miles farther from Japan than anyone had hoped. The launch point sat 650 nautical miles away from their target, and the mathematics looked grim. Each B-25 carried exactly 1,521 gallons of fuel. At maximum efficiency, if everything went right, they might, just might, reach the Chinese coast on the other side. The reality of modern warfare had struck America like a hammer on December 7, 1941. Geographic isolation meant nothing anymore. The Japanese had proved that when their carrier aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor without warning. If Japan could reach America across thousands of miles of ocean, then America could certainly reach Japan. The psychological truth was simple and brutal. Strike the enemy's homeland, shatter the myth of imperial invincibility that had fueled Japanese expansion across the entire Pacific. Make the Japanese people understand that their nation could bleed. President Franklin Roosevelt had demanded retaliation. Not next year, not when American factories had churned out overwhelming military superiority. Now, while American bodies still floated in Pearl Harbor's oil-slicked waters. While Japanese forces rolled unopposed through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, capturing vast territories. The American public needed to see their nation strike back with force and audacity. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, understood the strategic puzzle completely. Japan's defensive perimeter formed an enormous arc stretching from the Kuril Islands all the way down to the Dutch East Indies. It was a chain of fortified positions and naval bases that would take years, perhaps decades, to overcome using conventional invasion tactics. But the Japanese homeland itself sat behind that defensive screen, protected by distance, early warning systems, and the fundamental assumption that no American bomber existed that could possibly reach Tokyo from any base currently held by the United States. Captain Francis Lowe, operations officer on King's staff, had watched something remarkable on January 10, 1942, at Naval Station Norfolk Chambers Field. Army Air Force's bombers were practicing carrier deck takeoffs. The runway was painted with the outline of a carrier deck to simulate landing operations. Twin-engine bombers launching from aircraft carriers. The idea violated every single principle of naval aviation doctrine. It shouldn't work. It couldn't work. But Lowe's observations sparked something revolutionary. What if it could work? The USS Hornet displaced 19,800 tons of water in standard condition, swelling to 2,500 tons when fully loaded for combat. Her flight deck stretched 809 feet in length and 86 feet across in width. 4 Parsons-geared steam turbines generated 120,000 shaft horsepower, driving the massive carrier through Pacific swells at 32.5 knots. Captain Mark Andrew Mitchell commanded 2,919 officers and men under normal operations. But on this mission, his ship carried something completely different. No Navy aircraft would operate from her decks. Every available square foot of the flight deck was now occupied by 16 U.S. Army Air Force's B-25B Mitchell medium bombers, packed wing to wing like sardines in a tin. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his reputation towered over American aviation like a giant. He held an MIT doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He had won the Schneider Trophy, the Thompson Trophy, and the Bendix Trophy in racing competition. He was the first pilot ever to perform an outside loop, the first to fly coast to coast in under 24 hours, the first to take off, fly, and land using only instruments, with no outside visibility. At 45 years old, Doolittle had spent more time in experimental aircraft than most pilots had spent in the air at all. The B-25B Mitchell represented American industrial engineering at its absolute finest. The wingspan measured 67 feet 7 inches. The fuselage stretched 53 feet 6 inches long. Empty, the aircraft weighed 21,100 pounds. Two Wright R2600-13 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower, provided the power. Standard specifications called for a range of 1,350 miles with a 3,000-pound bomb load. But standard specifications meant nothing on this mission. North American aviation's engineers had essentially rebuilt each aircraft from the ground up. The lower gun turret was removed entirely, saving 600 pounds and eliminating aerodynamic drag that would have robbed them of precious fuel. Additional fuel tanks were welded into the bomb bay, crawlway, and the space where the turret used to sit. Fuel capacity jumped from 646 gallons to 1,141 gallons. The sophisticated Norden bomb sight was replaced with a crude 20-cent device designed by Captain Charles Ross Greening, constructed from materials any hardware store could supply. The logistics confronting them were absolutely unforgiving. A standard carrier takeoff normally required 500 feet of deck run. The B-25s would have exactly 467 feet from starting position to the bow. Wind over the deck would need to exceed 40 knots to generate sufficient lift for takeoff. Each bomber weighed 31,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel and bombs, nearly twice the weight of any Navy carrier aircraft. No Army bomber had ever launched from a carrier in combat conditions. No medium bomber had ever attempted a mission requiring a 2,400-mile flight over open water without a single fighter escort for protection. The Japanese Homeland Defense System in April 1942 represented 3 years of careful planning and absolute confidence in its effectiveness. The Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet controlled the Western Pacific from the Aleutian Islands down to Australia. Land-based aircraft provided overlapping coverage from chains of island bases. Submarine patrol lines monitored the approaches to Japan's home islands. But the first line of defense was more basic and supposedly foolproof. The picket boat line consisted of converted fishing vessels positioned at 50-mile intervals, extending 600 to 700 miles outward from the Japanese coast. Each boat carried radio equipment capable of transmitting contact reports directly to naval headquarters in Tokyo. The Nito Maru was officially listed as a 70-ton patrol vessel, though in reality she was nothing more than a requisitioned fishing boat. Her crew numbered 11 sailors. Her only armament was a single machine gun. Her mission was simple: spot American ships and radio their position before being destroyed. Vice Admiral Tuichi Nagumo commanded the first air fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor. He maintained with absolute certainty that American carriers could never approach within 600 miles of Japan without detection. His 6 fleet carriers had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Salamis that carrier aviation was the decisive weapon of modern naval warfare. The nearest American bases capable of launching heavy bombers were in the Aleutians, over 2,000 miles from Tokyo. B-17 flying fortresses based in Australia were 3,000 miles away. The mathematics of fuel consumption and bomb load made any conventional bombing raid impossible. General Hideki Tojo, both Prime Minister and War Minister, had personally assured Emperor Hirohito that the divine winds, the kamikaze, that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries ago would protect the homeland from American attack. The Japanese public had been told repeatedly that their islands were surrounded by an impenetrable defensive screen. Enemy aircraft would never darken Japanese skies. This absolute certainty would make the psychological impact of the Doolittle raid far more devastating than its physical damage. At 3:10 in the morning on April 18th, the radar operator aboard USS Enterprise reported surface contact bearing 028 degrees, range 21,000 yards. The contact was tracking southwest at 9 knots, moving directly across Task Force 16's intended track toward the launch point. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, commanding the entire task force from Enterprise, faced an immediate decision with no good options. Continue toward the optimal launch point and risk detection by enemy forces, or launch immediately from beyond the planned range. Neither choice was acceptable. Both were necessary. The Japanese picket boat Nitomaru had spotted the American task force at 5:30 in the morning. Radio operator First Class Nakamura transmitted the contact report in urgent voice transmission. 3 enemy carriers sighted, position 650 nautical miles east of Inubasaki, force headed west at 20 knots. The message was garbled by atmospheric interference and poor transmission quality, but enough fragments reached Tokyo to trigger an alert at Naval Headquarters. USS Nashville opened fire at 5:38. Her 6-inch guns straddled the picket boat with the second salvo. The Nitomaru burned and sank within minutes in the heavy seas, but her warning had already been transmitted. The message was received. Halsey made the only decision a combat commander could make: launch immediately or abort the entire mission and turn back. There was no middle ground. At 6:20 in the morning, he signaled the Hornet with 3 words that would echo through history: launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, Halsey signaled, "Good luck and God bless you." Doolittle's B-25, tail number 40EMS-22344, was positioned exactly 467 feet from the bow. Navy launch officer Lieutenant Henry Miller stood at the port side of the flight deck, timing the carrier's pitch in the 30-foot swells. As the Hornet's bow reached the bottom of a trough and began its climb upward, Miller swung his checkered flag in a tight circle, the signal to advance the throttles to maximum power. Flight engineer Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard watched the engine instruments climb steadily as cylinder head temperatures rose toward the red line. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole called out airspeed as the bomber accelerated down the spray-soaked deck. 40 knots, 50, 60, the white line marking the deck's edge rushed toward them with terrifying speed. At 8:20 in the morning, with less than 50 feet of deck remaining, Doolittle pulled back hard on the control yoke. The B-25 staggered into the air, dipped toward the waves as it lost the wind bursting over the carrier's bow, then slowly climbed into the grey morning. The first bomber was airborne. 15 more bombers would follow at 4-minute intervals. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft cleared the deck with 10 feet to spare. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber dropped so low after launch that spray from the propeller wash soaked the tail gunner's position. Captain David Jones watched green water break over his windscreen before finally achieving positive climb. Every single pilot performed a miracle of aviation, launching overloaded bombers from a pitching deck into gale force winds. Flying was possible. Flight was impossible. Yet they did it. The 16 B-25s flew individually toward Japan, maintaining complete radio silence and flying at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, magnetic compass, and drift meter. No radio beacons, no weather updates, no fighter escort. Each 5-man crew was utterly alone over 650 miles of hostile ocean. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's bomber reached the Japanese coast at 12:30 in the afternoon, local time. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter had calculated their position within 5 miles, despite flying through rain squalls and variable winds that twisted the aircraft unpredictably. The crew could see Japanese civilians waving from fishing boats, apparently believing the low-flying bomber was a Japanese patrol aircraft conducting routine operations. The false gun barrels installed in the tail cones had achieved their deception perfectly. Tokyo's air raid warning system had been activated at 9 o'clock in the morning, based on the Nitomaru's report, but had been stood down at noon when no enemy aircraft appeared. The population of 6.5 million was conducting normal Saturday activities when Doolittle's bombardier, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, opened the bomb bay doors at 1:15 in the afternoon. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters dropped from 200 feet, spreading destruction across 10 city blocks in the Chiyoda district. 30 seconds later, Lieutenant Travis Hoover's crew bombed the Tokyo Special Steel Company factory complex. The powder works erupted in a column of flame visible from 20 miles away. Lieutenant Robert Gray struck the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company engineering facility. Lieutenant Everett Holstrom hit the Agura Oil Company refinery. Lieutenant David Jones dropped his bombs on military warehouses in the Yokohama district. Each bomber carried a specific target folder with intelligence photos and maps, but weather navigation errors and intense anti-aircraft fire forced rapid tactical decisions in the moment. The second wave of bombers arrived over Japan between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, piloting the Green Hornet, struck the steel mills at Yokohama despite heavy anti-aircraft fire that punched holes in his fuselage. Lieutenant Ted Lawson bombed the Nippon Machinery Works. Lieutenant Harold Watson hit the Tokyo Naval Arsenal. Lieutenant Richard Joyce struck the Japan Special Steel Company. Each crew reported successful bomb runs, though accurate damage assessment was impossible while flying at maximum speed toward the Chinese coast with Japanese fighters pursuing them. Captain Edward York faced mechanical failure 200 miles from Japan. His B-25's left engine was consuming fuel at twice the normal rate. Unable to reach China or Soviet territory with certainty, York made a desperate decision. He turned northwest toward Soviet territory, landing at Vladivostok after a grueling 6-hour flight. The crew would spend 14 months in Soviet internment, a diplomatic complication that Moscow handled by officially denying their presence while privately treating them as honored guests. Lieutenant William Farrow's bomber arrived over Nagoya as air defense fighters scrambled from Kasumigara Naval Air Station. 9 Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighters pursued Farrow's B-25, but the bomber's low altitude and maximum speed prevented effective interception. The nimble Japanese fighters couldn't match the American bomber's velocity at that altitude. Corporal Jacob DeShazer released 4 incendiary clusters over the Mitsubishi aircraft factory, destroying the paint shop and damaging the assembly building. The psychological impact multiplied with each explosion. Tokyo had not heard air raid sirens since the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Children ran from their schools. Office workers fled into streets. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was inspecting military bases during the raid when one B-25 came so close that he could see the pilot through the windscreen, though the American bomber never fired at him. The raid had shattered the illusion of Japanese invulnerability. The divine winds had not protected the homeland. The impenetrable defensive screen had failed. Americans could reach Tokyo. As the B-25s turned toward China, their fuel gauges dropped toward empty faster than calculated. Headwinds exceeding 25 knots increased fuel consumption beyond worst-case planning. The mathematics that had looked grim on the Hornet's flight deck now looked absolutely catastrophic. The airfield at Chuchao sat silent and empty. The Chinese were supposed to have beacons burning bright and runway lights glowing to guide the bombers safely down. Radio operators kept calling. Nobody answered. The crews were facing choices that no pilot ever wants to face. Try landing on terrain they couldn't see, or risk everything on a water landing in complete darkness. Ted Lawson pushed his B-25 down toward the dark water below. He was going for it, a controlled ditching at 110 miles per hour. The nose hit first, and the impact was catastrophic. The bomber split in half like it was made of paper. Lawson got thrown right through the windscreen. When he came to rest in the water, his body was broken. His left leg was shattered with a compound fracture. His face was torn open and bleeding badly. Several teeth were gone, knocked clean out by the force of the impact. Charles McClure, a fellow officer, saw what happened and didn't hesitate. He spotted the unconscious pilot and pulled him out of the sinking aircraft. David Thatcher, the gunner, kept diving back into the burning fuselage again and again, fighting the rising water to grab equipment and medical supplies. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he kept going anyway. Nobody in China had been told that American bombers were coming. Security was tight and communication had fallen apart. Chiang Kai-shek found out about the raid the same way the rest of his country did, by watching bombers suddenly appear in his skies. The Chinese military didn't recognize them. "Those look like Japanese planes," somebody shouted. Within seconds, anti-aircraft guns opened up. American B-25s were being shot at by their supposed allies. Donald Smith was piloting one of those bombers when the ground fire found him near Nanchang. His engines got hit. The whole aircraft shuddered and started losing altitude fast. There was no choice. Bail out. He and his crew scattered into the night, their parachutes opening above Japanese-controlled territory. They were landing in the enemy's backyard. The weather over China got worse as darkness fell. Clouds thickened and dropped lower and lower. Pilots could see maybe half a mile in any direction, less if they got unlucky. Mountain peaks rose up to 6,000 feet right where the crews were supposed to fly. No radio beacons to guide them, maps that were practically useless. The pilots were operating on instinct, prayer, and pure luck. The fuel gauges didn't lie. They were reading empty. By 2,200 hours, most of the bombers had burned through everything they had. Pilots could hear their engines starting to sputter. Harold Watson knew his time was up. Both engines quit at 11,000 feet. He gave the order, "Everybody out." His 5 crew members floated down through the darkness, scattered across 20 miles of mountains in Zhejiang province. Watson's parachute caught in a tree, and there he hung, suspended 30 feet above the ground in freezing rain. He stayed there for 6 hours, yelling until his voice went hoarse, until finally some Chinese farmers heard him and climbed up to cut him down. Dean Hallmark was flying one of the last bombers. After dropping his payload on Yokohama, he turned his Green Hornet toward China as the sun disappeared. Chase Nielsen was doing the math in the navigator's seat. They'd made it across the Chinese coast, he was pretty sure. But where were the airfields? The fuel tanks were bone dry. Both engines were running on fumes, on the last molecules of gasoline. At 23:45, Hallmark made his decision. The crew braced themselves. Here it comes. The B-25 hit the water with violent force. The impact slammed Hallmark hard against the instrument panel. His skull took the full force. Blood poured down his face. Co-pilot Robert Mader was knocked unconscious immediately. In the back, bombardier William Dieter and engineer Donald Fitzmaurice were trapped. Water rushed in. They didn't make it out. Nielsen somehow got through the shattered canopy. He grabbed Hallmark. He grabbed Mader. He pulled them both to shore, bleeding and gasping. William Farrow faced the same nightmare. His bomber ran out of fuel over Chinese territory after bombing Nagoya. The crew bailed out into darkness at 8,000 feet, unable to see the ground. Jacob de Chazer hit hard and landed in a rice paddy, a field used for human waste and fertilizer. He was covered in filth. He couldn't speak Chinese. He was lost and alone in a country at war. He wandered for hours before a Japanese patrol found him. He would spend 40 months locked in solitary confinement after that, beaten and tortured for information about American aircraft carriers. William Farrow and navigator George Barr were captured within hours. Harold Spatz hid in a Buddhist temple until Japanese soldiers found him there. They beat him unconscious. Robert Hite tried getting help from Chinese villagers, not knowing they'd been threatened with execution if they helped any American. The Japanese came down on the captured airmen hard and fast. Emperor Hirohito ordered that all captured airmen be executed as war criminals. The raiders hadn't worn military uniforms during the bombing run, a technical decision that changed everything, under international law that made them spies. In Shanghai, 8 captured crewmen were put through mock trials. The verdict was predetermined. On October 15, 1942, Farrow and Hallmark and Spatz were tied to wooden crosses in a cemetery outside Shanghai. They were blindfolded. They were given a moment for prayer. Then the firing squad did its work. Their bodies were cremated afterward, the ultimate humiliation in Japanese eyes. Hallmark's co-pilot Robert Mader survived the crash but died in captivity on December 1, 1943, wasting away from dysentery and starvation. Nielsen and High and Barr and de Chaser endured 3.5 years of torture and solitary cells and starvation before liberation came in August 1945. What kept them alive was supporting each other, a Bible that someone had smuggled in, and sheer stubborn refusal to let their captors win. 69 of the 80 Doolittle raiders eventually made it to safety. 3 died in crashes or drowned. 8 were captured by the Japanese. 1 crew was interned in the Soviet Union. Every single B-25 was destroyed, crashed or abandoned so the Japanese couldn't capture them. The physical damage to Japan was small: 50 dead, 252 wounded, 112 buildings destroyed or damaged. Jimmy Doolittle stood in a Chinese rice field looking at his smashed bomber, thinking about what he'd done. He called his crew together and told them he expected a court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. "I've lost every single plane," he said. "The whole operation was supposed to boost morale back home. And instead, I've just proven that bombers can't operate from carriers." His engineer, Paul Leonard, looked at him and said something that changed everything. "Colonel, you've just won the Medal of Honor." The Japanese Navy reacted immediately. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was eating breakfast when the reports came in. He didn't say anything for 30 minutes. He just sat there, thinking. Then he issued orders that would lead to Japan's first major defeat. The Midway operation, something the Naval General Staff had already dismissed as unnecessary, was suddenly approved. Yamamoto wanted the American carriers destroyed. He wanted them hunted down and eliminated. He wanted the Navy that had humiliated him to pay. President Roosevelt announced the raid to the American people, but he wasn't going to tell them where the bombers came from. When asked, he smiled and said Shangri-La, the fictional paradise from James Hilton's novel. The American public was desperate for good news. They'd been losing battles for months. They cheered. War bond sales jumped 20% in the week after the announcement. The real impact went far beyond what the bombs had damaged. 4 Japanese Army fighter groups were pulled back from the Southwest Pacific to defend the homeland. Those squadrons were desperately needed in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Their absence helped the Americans win at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. The Japanese Navy rushed the Midway operation forward by 6 weeks, which meant less time for planning, less time for preparation, and mistakes waiting to happen. China paid the highest price for the American success. Japanese forces launched Operation Seigo as payback. They deployed 100,000 troops into Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, right where Doolittle's crews had landed. The orders were simple and brutal. Destroy anyone who might have helped the Americans. Entire villages were burned to ash. Wells were poisoned with cholera and typhoid bacteria. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians died in 3 months of systematic extermination. The technological lessons changed everything. Skip bombing techniques were developed based on what they learned. The B-25's performance inspired modifications that created heavily armed variants used all throughout the Pacific War. Engineers mounted 75mm cannons in the nose of new models, turning medium bombers into flying artillery platforms. These planes would devastate Japanese shipping lanes. Admiral Yamamoto's obsession with eliminating the American carrier threat led directly to the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942. The Japanese Navy sent 4 fleet carriers, convinced that overwhelming force would win the day. American codebreakers had read the Japanese communications. 3 American carriers were waiting. In 5 minutes of diving attacks, bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown destroyed 2 Japanese carriers. A third was sunk hours later. The 4th carrier went down before the day was over. 4 fleet carriers and their experienced pilots, gone. The ships could eventually be replaced. The pilots never could. Years of combat experience went down with them. The entire balance of power in carrier warfare shifted to America that day, and it never shifted back. Everything traced back to 16 B-25s launched from the USS Hornet on a stormy April morning. Jimmy Doolittle got the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt on May 19, 1942. He was promoted directly to Brigadier General, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. He would command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, then the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and finally the 8th Air Force in England. Every single member of the raid received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Chinese government awarded them the Order of the Cloud and Banner. The human impact echoed through the decades. Ted Lawson wrote a memoir called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo that became a bestseller and was made into a Hollywood film. Jacob de Chesa, after 40 months of torture in Japanese prisons, came back to Japan as a missionary. He actually converted one of his former prison guards to Christianity. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, lived to 103 years old. When he died in 2019, he was the last surviving Doolittle raider. The technical lessons shaped military doctrine forever. Carrier-based aviation transformed from fleet defense into power projection. Joint operations between Army and Navy forces, revolutionary in 1942, became standard practice. Special operations requiring extreme range and minimal support trace their heritage back to those 16 bombers heading into an impossible mission. Japanese military historians later looked back and saw the Doolittle raid as the real turning point of the Pacific War, not Pearl Harbor, which had made the Japanese confident, and not Midway, which was still 2 months away. It was the moment when American bombers appeared over Tokyo and proved that the ocean barriers protecting Japan for 1,000 years meant nothing anymore. The age of carrier aviation had arrived, and Japan's traditional defenses were obsolete. The executions haunted the Japanese military command. Hallmark was barely able to walk because of his injuries, but he walked to his execution with his head up and his dignity intact. At 4:30 in the afternoon on October 15, 1942, at a cemetery outside Shanghai, the 3 men were tied to wooden crosses and blindfolded. They were given time for prayer. Then the soldiers fired. Their bodies were cremated after. The worst possible dishonor in Japanese custom. The operational statistics were staggering. 16 bombers, each weighing 31,000 pounds, launched from a carrier deck in 40-knot winds and 30-foot seas. They flew 650 miles to cities they'd never seen before, navigating by compass and pure instinct. They dropped 64,000 pounds of bombs across 5 Japanese cities in broad daylight. Then they flew another 1,500 miles, trying to land in darkness over terrain they couldn't see. The USS Hornet survived only 6 more months after launching the Doolittle raiders. She went down at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942, taking 140 aircraft and 111 crew members to the ocean floor. But her legacy was written on April 18th, when 16 Army bombers did what Japanese military planners had said was impossible. The raid was more than military strategy. It demonstrated that creativity could overcome being outnumbered, that courage could replace resources, that 16 aircraft could shift the balance of the world's biggest war. The Japanese learned their homeland was vulnerable. The Americans learned they could win. Both lessons shaped the entire bloody progression of the Pacific War toward Tokyo Bay and unconditional surrender. In the National Museum of the United States Air Force, a twisted piece of aluminum with serial number 40ANS2267 sits in a display case. It's all that remains of one B-25, recovered from a Chinese mountainside in 1962. The metal is scarred from impact and weathered by decades of wind and rain. But when forensic analysts examined it, they found something remarkable: traces of Tokyo factory smoke embedded in the aluminum. Molecular evidence that this plane had dropped its bombs on the enemy's homeland. In 1959, something unexpected happened. Prince Nobuhito Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's own brother, attended a Doolittle raider reunion in Tucson, Arizona. Someone asked why he had traveled so far to be there. He answered simply, "Your 16 planes changed our world. They proved that courage and innovation could defeat tradition, sudden, and expectation. The bombs you dropped on Tokyo were small. The ideas you dropped were devastating." Every modern carrier aircraft launching from American flight decks carries the legacy of April 18, 1942. Every joint service operation builds on what those crews proved: that service boundaries don't matter when national survival is at stake. The Doolittle raid didn't win the Pacific War. It proved the Pacific War could be won. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers carried more than bombs and fuel that day. They carried the concentrated will of a nation that had been hurt but not broken. They carried the promise that distance provided no protection from American retaliation. They carried the future of carrier aviation and special operations and joint service cooperation. Most of all, they carried proof that in modern warfare, the impossible isn't impossible. It's just difficult. and the difficult is just another Tuesday.